Hey, what's up everyone? It's Joe from Gadgetry Tech, and in today's video we're going to talk about doing custom EQ, or what equalizer changes mean, how the settings work, so you can understand what is happening behind the scenes and hopefully use that to make your own, maybe fix some of the stuff that you've done before, or at least get the most out of your products. It's also going to help explain my approach on all of this and kind of give you the backstory and some things along the way. So what is EQ? Well, EQ is basically using some form of software or hardware, and there's different methods of EQ, to alter the sound of the device you're listening to. And you can increase certain sounds or decrease certain sounds. Maybe you want less bass or more bass. Maybe you want more treble or less treble. So in a simple sense, that's how it works. Now, where it gets tricky is, what do you adjust? How much do you adjust by? Is there a right or wrong? And in a simple sense is some audiophiles, and rightly so, they've been doing this for a long time. Some people will definitely wince at extreme EQ settings because it typically alters the sound in a negative way if you go too hard with custom EQ for the device you're using. It also can introduce other issues, but in the context of doing EQ, you want to still preserve a somewhat natural sound. However, at the end of the day, if you make your own setting that you like, who cares what other people think? It's for you. If you're sharing it with the community and say this is the best EQ you can do and it's pretty bad, then maybe do some research. But at the end of the day, do stuff that makes you happy. So I'm going to do a few different headset explanations. I'll show you Equalizer APO and Peace add-on for Windows. I'll show you a snapshot of Dolby Atmos, Turtle Beach Stealth software, and of course the Astro A50X that we're on screen with now, because this is actually a really good headset for doing custom EQ and explaining it. So before I get any further, I want to talk about how my measurements work. So I have a very large measurement database. In fact, I'll pull it up for you. Now, this database has a lot of headset measurements and a lot of headphone measurements, and I'm not done. I add more all the time. So let's say you have a Corsair HS80. This is how it measured on my rig with the stock flat EQ. And then you look at the Odyssey Maxwell, very different sound signature. So doing all this helps get you a better understanding of, how it measures on my system. So my system is using this. I don't know how well this is going to get cut on the camera. I have Gross KB006 pinna clones, and I use an IEC 711 coupler clone, which allows me to monitor, test both the left and right channel. I do multiple measurements of each side, and that also converts to allow me to review IEMs and wireless earbuds. When I do this, so I'm going to minimize this here, this program is called R-E-W, Room EQ Wizard. So if I want to do a new measurement, and on the Astro software, let's just show here that it's on default. I've made some changes, so this is in a very simple sense, but in my preferences, I have the output device being my Astro headset, and the input is one of my XLR interfaces, which, is that on camera? Oh, look at that, it's in. So that's my wave interface. I was trying to be careful not to unplug it or I'll mess things up. So if I click measure, I'm going to bring this over here. Now I'm going to be quiet during this very short part, but this is where I name my measurement. And right here, I'm measuring the left channel because that's where my microphone is. So I'm going to hit start. There we go. So my measurement's done. Now I'm going to clear all measurements that I have here. And let's just pull up the last one I just did. So this is what I just measured with the flat EQ. And it's a little jagged. This is kind of normal. Typically when you do over-ear measurements, you use the actions in RU and do 124 smoothing. And you can see the line looks a little bit more normal. We're getting rid of the artifacts and stuff that frankly isn't going to change anything for how we understand the sound. So what this measurement indicates is how my artificial ears hear the headset. That's really important, because if you compare my measurements to someone else's measurements, unless they have my exact rig and place the headset the exact same way, it's going to be interpreted slightly differently. So you can use my website to compare measurements from one headset to another, on my rig. Don't use my measurement and then ratings or headphones.com and assume that there's 100% parity here, because ear pinna and all these other changes happen. But you know, if I were to compare the A50X, just to show you how to use this site, by the way, this is important as well. So you can see the URL at the top here. If I click on the plus sign next to A50 Gen 4, now it's showing me what the flat profile of the Gen 4 sounds like compared to the flat profile on the A50X. I say flat profile because this is the next step I want to talk about. When we look at the Astro software, the default EQ shows flat. You can see here that the line is flat. That means the EQ is flat. It doesn't mean that the headset is flat, which you can see here in the measurements. So when you're making changes, you're not shaping your own custom curve from scratch. You are modifying the existing curve of the headset. And that's why on the audiophile side of things, if you're going plus and minus to all these extremes, you're not going to have a smooth response on the sound profile. So I did that. So to show you what that means, this is the default sound profile as measured earlier with the exact placement that I had. Now, if I look at modifying the EQ, and here is a graphic equalizer setting of 500 hertz plus 6 decibels. You can see there's a spike right here. That's the only thing I modified. Everything else is essentially the same, but you can see this big lift at 500 hertz. That doesn't quite follow a natural frequency response, so that frequency area as a whole will stand out. Now, if I do, this is graphic EQ. There's another thing called parametric EQ, which the red line you can see is fairly close, and that has a Q factor setting of 1.5. So what is a Q factor? I'm so glad you asked. Now it's time to understand how this works. This is more of a mathematical thing. A Q factor basically represents how wide your bandwidth is when targeting frequency response. So if you go from one octave to another, so which is, let's say, 1,000 hertz to 2,000 hertz, your Q factor is 1.414 technically, because I think I can just pull this up on a calculator here. If you see this calculator, so if I just do the square root of 2, there is my 1.41. Conversely, if you're going wider, and I pulled up a little chart here just to give you a screenshot opportunity. So if you want to address more octaves to have a wider impact on your frequency response, your Q factor would go down. 0.7 will address 2 full octaves, 1.4, 1 octaves, 2.8, half an octave. And when you look at that on software, so let's go to my new equalizer preset. This is just a demo. Q factor on this 1,000 hertz or 1 kilohertz, you can see down here it says 2.8. If I change this to 0.707, look what it does. Now I'm widening my impact on the sound. So if you want, we can measure this. So let's go all the way to 0.3. Let's go really wide. And of course I modified which one I was changing, so let's fix that. So you can see a nice wide sweep at 1,000 hertz. Everything else is set to flat. So we're going to clear these measurements and we're going to measure. Now, compared to the stock sound signature, the orange line represents the change I just made by having a really wide Q factor. You can see I lifted this huge area right here. So let's go back to the Logitech software, the G-Hub software, and I'm going to set the Q to 4, and look what happens. Do you see how narrow that got? That is a massive change. So let's measure it again. Now, if we look, and again, I'll clean up the line. This is the exact same decibel lift at the same exact frequency. We're targeting, 1,000 kilohertz, right? The only thing I changed was the Q factor, how wide or narrow. And look at what that did to the sound signature. Massive difference in the mid-range, massive difference in the treble and presence region, as the frequencies go up. Instead, with a Q factor of 4, which is pretty narrow, I'm only really addressing this narrow peak kind of right here, because you can see this still follows a general curve anyway. So I'm really only targeting, again, very narrow window. And if you look at that little chart that I had earlier, it's essentially a third of an octave, close to it being 4.3, doing a third. So how does this translate? Well, visually, that's what you see on the graph. But how you would use that in real life is if you want to lift all of the bass as a whole, maybe target 80 hertz and do a wide Q factor, and it's going to have a huge impact on the wide frequency of bass. So if you find that your headset is too bass heavy, or too bass light, that's one way you can do it, is with a wide Q. Now, if the bass is very strong, you could do the same thing, a Q of 0.5, for example, and -4 decibels, and just start from there. And this is kind of how you play around with the sound impact. Now, the Logitech software is cool because it gives you a visual aid on how this works. So I'm going to zero this out, and I want to show you, we'll do something with the bass here. Zero gain, and let's go, this one's 50 hertz, so let's switch this to 70, well, we'll do 64 hertz. Then we'll do a lift of 4, and this is how I'm lifting my bass. That's not, again, not my curve, but how I'm focusing on lifting the bass. If I go to 0.3, you can see now I'm lifting bass as a whole. Now, this is a fun way to do custom EQ to understand what you're doing. Now, let's say I wanted to lift footsteps, because I talk about custom EQ in game. So I'm going to set this back to 0, and I'm going to target 125 hertz here. I want to do a 5 decibel lift, but Q factor of 1.5 isn't bad. Maybe I want to be a little bit more narrow, so I'll go 1.8. You can see it's a little bit more narrow. Now, the impact of this is I am also increasing the bass a little bit at 200, 250 hertz. You can see this drop off. That's because parametric EQ is logarithmic. It's not linear. So what I could do is take this frequency, let's say 220 hertz. Again, this is just a visual example. -3 dB with a Q factor, and look at the difference already on my sound. A Q factor of 2. I want to narrowly reduce some of this bass. So now I'm emphasizing 125 hertz, which is a great frequency to emphasize for games like Call of Duty, but I'm cleaning up the mix a little bit by getting rid of that muddy sound of the bass. This is really important for something like the Astro A50, which sounds a little bit thick and heavy in the bass region. I can still benefit from boosted bass where I want it, but clean up the bass that I don't care. Conversely, if I go to 20 hertz, -6 decibels, and of course I did +6, let's go to -6, and look what that does to the bass curve. So again, I'm only focusing on the bass frequencies. I didn't modify my treble at all, and now I'm benefiting from this bass focus. So that's how parametric EQ works. Now, if you have the ability to run parametric EQ, let's say you have the Astro A50X, which this saves to the headset, amazing for console players because now you benefit from this. The other options on PC are using the Piece add-on, which is this guy right here for Equalizer APO. I will have links in the description below. It's not as visual initially, but you can see all these frequencies up here. The advantage to parametric EQ on Piece compared to Astro's A50, for example, is this one's capped at 6 decibels. Maybe you need more than 6 or less than 6, or less than -6 if you're doing something more extreme. You can also do more than 10 bands, which is pretty complex, obviously, so you can really fine-tune it. And then you can even do something called the shelf, which is where you lift everything very widely at a low side or a high side. So if I wanted to lift all the frequencies above 14,000 hertz, for example, I can type 14,000 right here, and let's type this correctly. And I'll switch this to a high shelf. And let's do, oops, I did high shelf, Q is slope. I just want to do a high shelf for now, which gets rid of the Q option, 5 decibel lift. And then if I go to the visualizer, this is the impact of that EQ setting. This is like specific to Call of Duty for the VZR Model 1, so the rest of it's going to look kind of weird. But if I get rid of that shelf right here and I switch it to 0, watch what happens right up here. Do you see how it dropped? So it's a very powerful tool, and you have different ways to do it. Sonar from SteelSeries also gives you a 10-band parametric EQ, and I think it goes to ±9 or 10 decibels. So you get a lot of flexibility there, and you can even do a Q factor as narrow as like 10, so you can really create notches. When you would create a notch, so the whole Q factor of 10, for example, or 8, something really specific, is like when I measure my games for custom target curves, I hear like a ticking sound from Call of Duty, something that's really ear-piercing and annoying, and frankly doesn't have as much of an overlap with other sounds. I might target that frequency and reduce it by 3 or 4 decibels. So I had one in the 4,000 hertz region on my Modern Warfare video for Search and Destroy, I believe it was. I created a little narrow notch, and then you can lift or reduce it depending on if that's something you want to hear or something you want to get rid of. So you can see how powerful this is. Now, not everyone has the ability to do parametric EQ, but I wanted to start with parametric EQ, not just because it's the most advanced, but because the Q factor thing is really important to understand. Because if I toggle off advanced on Astro's software, you see a 10 band. Now, this is not a traditional 10 band, by the way. A traditional 10 band EQ is more like this, where you get 32, 64, 125, 250, 500, etc. If you notice, these octaves are doubling each other, or these frequencies are doubling each other. So that's that whole double the octave thing, which means on something like Dolby Atmos, my Q factor is essentially 1.41. On a fixed 10 band or graphic equalizer, you can adjust the sliders up and down, but you cannot choose your Q factor, how wide or narrow. So it's important to know that assume everything you see here, in this case, has a Q factor of 1.4. This is going to come in handy later in the video when I show you how to visualize custom EQ changes on my Squiglink page. So this is the same, like I said, of setting 1.4. If you go to something like, let me pull up, I believe I have a screenshot of my Turtle Beach setting. Now, if you look at the custom EQ options on the 10 band for the Turtle Beach Stealth Pro, again, you see something very similar with the bands doubling each other. This again is where you can assume your Q factor is 1.5. So now that you know how this impacts it, if you're boosting 125 hertz, you would want to reduce the 250 a little bit to compensate. Otherwise, just keep in mind, you're going to increase that as well. Now, here's where it gets really cool, because we have a frequency response measurement again on the Astro A50X with my rig. You can see that if I expand down and I look at different tunes, my custom EQ, if I change the color here, will measure like this. And that's because of all the stuff I did on my Astro A50X review, reducing the bass and increasing the higher frequencies a little bit. I like this a lot for music and general gaming. Now, this is the first time I'm publicly discussing my Warzone 2023-2024 beta EQ, something specific for a game. This is where I want to change how we look at audio. Because if you look at Sonar, and I do want to give SteelSeries credit, I'm going to open it right now. I want to give SteelSeries credit for doing so many custom game EQs. It's a lot of work. Now, I don't know how accurate all of them are. I haven't played all the games. But the fact that they're giving you these options to do game presets, and the fact that you can use Sonar to effectively modify the sound of any audio device you own is awesome. So now that I've enabled Sonar, I can browse a lot of their game presets, and you can see this target curve right here. This, again, that's not the target curve of your headset, or that's not the exact way your headset's going to sound. It is simply boosting bass by a bit, scooping the mids, and then boosting treble. If you have a headset that's already boosted in this area, recessed in the mids, and boosted in the treble, this is going to be a very strong EQ for you. You're going to have tons of bass and tons of treble, and it's not going to complement it as well. So what I'm trying to do, after it takes about 40 hours per game EQ, is make my own custom targets. Now you can see this squiggly line looks all weird, right? But if you look closely, you know, when you compare it to the Harman curve is this dotted line right here, which is kind of like a general sound profile that most people like. It's a safer sound profile. So when you look at my Warzone 2024 beta, which if you're doing this, do this on a computer, not a phone, because it's really hard to navigate this site. If you click on it, this area up here, your higher frequencies are a little bit different, so some people may not like this. Again, this is just a target that I've been working on. You can tweak yourselves later, and that's why understanding how all of this worked prior to this part was really important. So this, as you can see, the bass doesn't really adhere to what I think is the ideal sound for Warzone. Again, beta target. So check out how amazing this tool is. If I click on Equalizer, once my target is enabled and I have a single headset on the screen, or at least I chose one if I had multiple, I can click something called Auto EQ. the website will now automatically make my own 10-band parametric EQ preset for the Astro A50X for Call of Duty Warzone. Not a universal EQ. It is specific and it's like right on the money. Not everyone's going to like this EQ, but now that you know how that works, you can adjust this. So the thing to keep in mind, if for the example on the Astro A50X, you can see a gain here of minus 7.7. This is just to adhere to the curve. It doesn't have to be perfect. Now the software only lets you go to minus 6. So if I change this to minus 6, let's fix that, minus 6 again. You can see I'm a little bit higher than the target, but that's okay. It's not the end of the world and it's still really close. So anything that exceeds the boundary of what your software allows you to do, just pull it back in. I'm going to bring this to 6. Everything else is within my gain level of plus or minus 6. And you can see it's actually really close to the target curve. So all I have to do if I want a specific Warzone EQ for how this headset measures, I look at those measurements, I go to G-Hub, click Advanced, then I literally just copy this one by one. I go to 26 Hertz here, I do a gain of minus 6, which is there, and a Q factor of 0.6. So we're almost like right on the money, just as my guess from earlier. So 53 Hertz is the next one. I'm going to click this dot, change it to 53 Hertz, 3.6 decibels, and I have a Q factor of 3. And look how this is starting to change very quickly here. And so I'm not going to go through every single one because this video is going to be kind of long anyway, and this is quite an in-depth tutorial, but there's minus 6, Q factor of 2.8. Do you see how cool this is starting to turn into? I want to do one more for the 125, otherwise it looks pretty weird. And I don't want people to pause it and assume that they're close. So 6 decibel lift, Q of 3.9. And now you can see how this looks on the software and what that translates to what you hear. Insanely powerful. So let's say I'm going to modify my model because we talked about the Turtle Beat Stealth Pro, for example. Now this is how the Stealth Pro measured in a default sound profile. You can see stock pad, signature EQ. This is also a nice benefit of doing it this way, by the way, because if you buy the Wicked Cushion Freeze Pad, do you see how it's different? That means a different EQ will benefit you more if you have a Wicked Cushion Freeze Pad. It's not the same. So my goal of this site is to help you get the best sound you can get for your exact setup. And these pluses and minuses and X's is where you can choose the sound signature. You can see WC Freeze Pad signature EQ. So I'm going to get rid of it, go back to Stealth Pro, the default sound signature. I'm going to go to EQ. This is where it gets more time consuming, but this is how you translate it to the Turtle Beach software, which again, we have fixed bands here, right? So as much as I love to do the exact thing, if you're on PC, you can still get an exact perfect EQ with auto EQ. And watch how powerful this is. So you can see I hit the target pretty much perfectly. I can hit export down here at the bottom. It's going to export a text file. Save the text file to your desktop. And then on the piece program, again, this is more for Windows people, or if you want to type it in manually on SteelSeries Sonar, you can do that. So all I have to do is click on import right here, and I can import whatever I export from this website, and it'll auto EQ everything. It even sets the gain up here, your preamplifying, because if I'm doing plus 10 decibels somewhere, you need to pull the preamplifier down to basically 10 minus 7 in that window. Otherwise, you might introduce distortion because you're clipping at that point. Now, I've already done this with several headsets, so let's do the Corsair Virtuoso Pro, for example. Yes, I don't care about my settings. This was the output of my website being imported into Piece. I didn't have to do anything myself, and then I'm ready to go. Let's say you're playing for console, though, and you're really trying to get the most out of your headset. We're going to go back over here. Now, this would have been great if I can do it. However, I can't on console because the app doesn't let me. So what you need to do is, if we look at this 10-band equalizer, we have to clone this in the website. So I'm going to round up and just do 32 Hertz, 64, 125, etc. So we're going to fill these in real quick. Now, there were two ways I could have approached this. I could have skipped the auto EQ first because if I know I'm doing graphic EQ only, I didn't need to have any pre-filled out variables. So it doesn't matter. You can either type this in and modify it all to 0 again. So let's do that now. So I have all the bands mirroring the program, okay? So which means once I hit this one on 0, we're back to the stock sound signature with no EQ. Now this is why I wanted to explain the video in the order I did. Your Q factor, I'm going to hit Control C and Control V, all of these. Because we know it's a 10-band fixed EQ and we understand how 1 octave represents a Q factor of 1.41, I'm going to set this tool to 1.41. So we have now duplicated the software in the Turtle Beach Stealth Pro app, the Audio Hub app. All I have to do now is start modifying this within the confines of the app. So if the maximum I can do is -7, for example, which it's not, I can go all the way down to -9. But if I can go to -9, let's just try -9 here. And do you see how this looks down here? Now, it's not an identical representation on what's below that, but it's very close. So don't mind this little spike. That's just all we can do in the app. So this is where you can see it's up in the 64 hertz area. It hikes back up okay. 80 hertz, that's really close to an area that I can't easily address with graphic EQ, but we're going to try. So I'm going to bring this down a little bit. This is the 64 hertz that I'm adjusting. Oops, I went to the wrong one here. Let's just lower that a little. Now, I can tell you, just to give you an insight on this curve, this hump that you have in the 50 hertz area, that's for the Loot Crate hum. It's not vital. It's just a little bit of an extra edge. So it's okay that we're not boosting it too much. Now, because I know I'm going to reduce this area a little bit, it's already scooped pretty well at 250. So you can see there's not a lot of changes needed. Now, from a personal preference, this curve that you see right now is the closest we can really get with a fixed 10-band EQ. So I understand it's not going to be a perfect match, but we're going to try to use this as a tool, again, to closely match it as much as possible. So if we look at 500 hertz, again, I'm right there. It's just a matter of if you want to lift it or not. So let's just go to minus 0.5 decibels. I'll lift this a little bit. We'll go plus 0.5. The rest of this looks okay. I think 2 kilohertz is slightly under, so we're going to lift 2 kilohertz just a little bit. The 4 kilohertz could be lifted. It's a mild EQ. Again, this kind of shows why the Turtle Beach Stealth Pro does so well with Call of Duty out of the box, because the sound signature actually works quite nice. Now, when you get to higher frequencies, this is where there's a massive difference in what the measuring rig can hear versus what you hear. So don't take this as like the Bible as far as measurement goes. When I do the auto EQ, I actually ignore everything above 10K because it's not reliable enough. However, I can tell you that the 8 kilohertz spike with the Turtle Beach is real. And that's that really sharp like sound that can make your ears wince when guns fire, or there's like just a sharp piercing sound in the game. So I'm going to reduce 8K. Let's just go to minus 4 decibels. So the green line is my new target curve, and I've reduced this a little. Now I could bring some of this gain back up here in the 2 to 4K region. So let's just hit 1 full decibel here. Let's bring 4 up a little bit, and I'm going to go to minus 5 dB on the 8K area. Again, this is with the stock pads. So this target EQ is something you can do in the app and benefit on console. It's not like you're stuck with parametric EQ for PC or nothing. That's how you match and get as close as you can with a 10-band fixed EQ. This same thing applies for Dolby Atmos. So if you're doing a 10-band EQ, again, let me pull up that picture. Here's Dolby Atmos. You can see the bands are the same way, also a Q of 1.4. So Xbox users, you can use Atmos. PC users, if you don't want to use any of the advanced software, you can use Dolby Atmos to closely mirror it as well. This is cool because we can also use different targets. So if I go to the Harman curve right here, I can then make my own changes to better match something for music. It's not so much an issue with certain headsets like this, but if you look at something like the older Corsair HS80, which has a very off and different sound signature, if I start modifying the custom EQ, you can see that same EQ I had before for the Turtle Beach produces a wildly different result. Even on the Warzone EQ, it's completely different. So again, I would just do, let's say, +4 here. Not liking what that looks like, so I go to +6. This is too hot in the 1K region, so I'm going to go to -3 decibels. And you can see this red line. Let's lift 500 by 2. And we have to reduce 250 for sure. Let's go -4 here. And 125 hertz, we're going to go to something more extreme like 4. Nope, that wasn't extreme enough. Let's go 5. So you can kind of see where the benefit of this is, because now you can get the most out of your own headset. And now that red line, look how quickly I'm approaching a more ideal sound signature for Call of Duty. Or again, the Harman curve, if I wanted to match that for music performance, which in this case, I would lift 4 kilohertz by 4 decibels. Now, because I lifted that and we have a Q of 1.4, I'm also lifting the lower frequencies. So now I'm going to reduce 2000 hertz by 2 decibels, and now I'm back more in line. It's pretty amazing what you can do once you understand how the Q factor of 1.41 plays into this tool to kind of optimize your own sound signature. We're going to straight up build a Harman target or close to it just using this software on the stream or on this live recording, because I'm not really doing any editing. And just like that, I have an HS80 that measured completely different, already sounding a lot better to, I think, a lot of people. I think they would like the way this performs. So look at that. I'm even more in line now. This is just using 10 band. I could have almost perfectly hit it if I'm using it on PC and I want to use those programs with parametric EQ. All I have to do is click auto EQ, and now look at the red line. We're even closer to those curves. Or if I want one for Call of Duty, I can click Warzone Beta, hit auto EQ again, and now my HS80 is tuned with parametric EQ for Warzone. So I know this video was really complex, but this is partly why my Warzone EQ video has been delayed. I'm likely going to reference this tutorial in the Call of Duty video because this is a huge part of getting the most out of your gear. But hopefully this helps save you some time, and now you can do some of the EQs of your own. And I guess in summary, to explain these frequencies very broadly, you have some descriptions down here on the site as well. If you click Subbase, it actually has written descriptions for you. So use this as a tutorial to help you understand what you're changing. This is probably the best way to quickly understand what you're addressing, but play with it too, because your ears are different than mine and you might have a different preference. So again, thank you so much for watching this. If you found this video helpful, please don't forget to like and subscribe. That's where a lot of brands look at, regardless of viewer count. They care how big the channels are, and I'd love to keep providing more coverage for you all. So thank you again, and I'll see you next time.